As you know, we're in a long-term relationship with St. John's School, and throughout the year, we launch various projects to support the students. Last spring, we raised over $5,000 that went towards clothing, shoes, sending kids to camp, and buying library books. And now it's back to school. A full list of what is needed is listed on the insert in your info folder, so check it out, buy it, and bring it in. Don't forget, September the 6th, we're back to 2 services, and Power Hour is back at both the 9:30 and 11 a.m. service for the kids. And finally, September the 13th is fall kickoff. Carnival games, food, special music, lots of stuff's going on for the kids. Make sure you're a part of things and invite a friend. Those are your announcements for this week. For everything else, find us at lakeviewchurch.com.
So it's a pleasure to be here once again, to have this opportunity. It's been a pleasure this summer, I think, to hear a variety of voices this summer, to hear people's stories. And I love catching a glimpse, hearing a little bit about what people are up to, how they're processing the Psalms in their own life and the meaning of those things for them. And so I'm honored to be able to share a little bit of my own story today and a little bit of my own processing of one of the Psalms. For me, it's been a pretty fantastic summer. As some of you, maybe all of you know, my wife and I had a little baby boy, Nelson, which has been super fun. And that, I think, has honestly made it like the best summer of my life. It's been so awesome. This is what I'm fussing about. That's what I was hoping for. I was hoping for a little the sort of alien-like cuteness going on there, you know? So I feel like I can get away with this because he's still only 7 weeks old, but I think there's probably a timeline when you stop publicly bragging on the stage about your kid. No? Okay, feedback after the service. Come see me. Say, Luke, at like 4 months, that's maybe the cutoff. Anyway. But this new chapter of my story has totally hooked me. I really enjoy it. Of course, there are new things I'm enjoying. There's old things I miss sometimes. But these new things I didn't expect to enjoy as much as I did because I didn't have any frame of reference for it. And so all first-time parents probably know, yeah, there's new things that you just couldn't imagine that you encounter. I have new rhythms in my life. One of the things I love to do, some mornings, I try most mornings in the week to take my little guy and go for a walk around the neighborhood. Sometimes we go get an espresso together, which is also helpful and very needed sometimes. We enjoy different kinds of rhythms together, and that's just a beautiful thing. I've had just a beautiful summer in that sense. You know, and so the Psalms, as I'm encountering the Psalms this summer, there are many beautiful Psalms. Psalms about praise, about thanksgiving. There's bits of poetic wisdom in the Psalms. There's Psalms about our relationships with our family, our relationship with God, questions, all this kind of beautiful stuff. So it seems odd to me as I sort of waded through, hey, which Psalm do I want to explore, and pondered about that, I landed upon Psalm 10. Which has nothing to do, it seems, with new life or beauty or otherwise, and it just doesn't seem to fit my current situation. In fact, it begins with this rather strong protest, where the psalmist says, "Why, Lord? Why do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" Psalm 10, like many other psalms, is a song of lament, complaint, petition, protest. So these 3 words I want to unpack a little bit: lament, complaint, and petition. As we've already heard Shauna reading this morning, there are many complaints. There is deep lament going on in this psalm. And like the similar lament-type psalms, the psalmist is calling God out on something, about something that's going on in the world. They're complaining about an enemy. And I find this psalm and psalms like this kind of interesting. I think I find them interesting because they're kind of confusing to me. Sometimes it's unrelatable to me. And this kind of complaining, this kind of lament, actually, if I think about it, is somewhat outside of my normal experience of relating to God. And so maybe that's part of my draw to this psalm, to sort of unpack, hey, how does another person, how have they developed their relationship with God? How has this psalmist developed their relationship with God? What's that all about? Sometimes I think when I approach these things, am I trying to fabricate an enemy? Do I need to find something to complain about? I don't want to be disingenuous about it. I don't want to try to create a negative feeling. And of course, there's times in my life where I do feel like complaining, but not on the level it seems as the psalmist is talking about. There's some pretty harsh words. So the question of why did I choose this psalm, I want to just sort of unpack by telling you a little bit of my story, a few bits and pieces here and there. So, the one thing is I didn't gravitate towards this psalm because I would say I've had or endured some sort of unique kind of suffering in my life. I grew up actually in a very supportive environment, relatively unspoiled environment. It was a town north of Saskatoon. It reminds me in so many ways of what I imagine the Shire to be. I was able to ride my bike on the wrong side of the road to the other side of town without really telling my family, and it was okay because those neighbors were looking out for me too. They could call my parents if they needed to. There were people with the trampoline in their backyard or the basketball hoop who basically every kid knew it was an open yard and we could go play there whenever we wanted to. It's a very unspoiled environment in so many ways. So my context growing up didn't really expose me to a whole lot of suffering, and it maybe even in some ways kind of buffered suffering in the world, especially at that level of the psalmist's complaint. And so, like many Western middle-class kids, one from a small town no less, my worldview was shaped by the way I lived. And I'd say what I did a lot of the time was try to fill spaces during the long winters and with not lots to do in these small towns with the pursuit of trying to have fun, find entertainment, find things to fill those gaps. As I reflect on that, though, the pursuit of fun, the pursuit of entertainment is an interesting thing, because the more that you invest in it, and I recognize this in my own life, the more I invest in myself, in a sense, finding things to entertain me, the more that space in myself gets taken up that is needed to focus outwards on others. Something I've come to recognize in the past years is that, and this is a hard thing for me to hear, but our investments, my investments, expose who I really am. That where I put my time and my energy, what I do with my money, where I put that, and maybe even, and this is a scary thing for me, how I choose to rest, what that looks like, that actually exposes who I am, what I care about. I'm not saying that any of that really necessarily I'm doing a poor job at it or anything, but there is truth to this idea that, what I eat is what I become, that my investments define me a little bit. Now, further along in my story after high school, post-college a little bit, I did a couple internships and had an opportunity to travel, and I had an itch to travel at that time. And again, maybe like many kids from a small town in rural Saskatchewan, it's interesting, you want to encounter some other place. But I can be honest, I don't think I was inspired to travel because of a sort of altruism. I don't think I was inspired or compelled to try to end suffering somewhere. I don't even know if I necessarily saw it at that point in my life. If anything, that way I spent my time, where I put my money, how I rested, actually did shape me if I look back at it. It compelled me to want to experience adventure. I wanted to have fun. I wanted to pursue self-exploration in some ways by encountering other places, other people. It's a little bit consumerist, if I have to be honest about it, but who was I to know at the time? Even so, even if the motivation wasn't perfect, and that's fine, what happened in these travels is I actually met people. I met and entered into relationships with people who had experienced suffering. So in unfamiliar places, you're going to find the unexpected, and here were some new stories for me to encounter. I want to share with you 4 stories of people I met on some of my travels here. Kajol, the girl in the middle. Beautiful little girl. She's part of a street kid gang in New Delhi, and I was working there with a team working on sort of a kids club type program. Learning about her story, it's incredibly sad, but when she was a toddler, she got ran over by a train which severed one of her legs and pretty much solidified her lifelong role as a beggar. Her friends, this little group of kids that we met with, these street kids, they work as beggars to support their families, and their families encourage it because that is the way of things. They're entrenched in this sort of hierarchical social system. This is the way things are from generation to generation. If you are a beggar, your children probably will be beggars. That's how we know to survive. That's the pattern they're familiar with. Now, I don't know if anyone saw Slumdog Millionaire, the movie. If you remember that movie, there's this opening scene of these kids kind of running through these maze-like streets in a bit of a pack. It actually kind of represents my experience well of my first encounters with these guys. I remember running over one of the overpasses where their families lived underneath, and I remember seeing a few of the kids that I recognized. They're kind of getting ready for the day. They would go out to the community center where all these shops were, and this is kind of where the hustle and bustle was. But I just remember they were kind of getting all riled up, and they like ran through the streets, and this just totally, I reminisced when I saw that movie. I remember once watching one of the little boys at this community center who'd sort of created some sort of a symbiotic relationship with one of the shopkeepers. This shopkeeper sold sandwiches, and this kid, I think, must have struck a deal because I'd see him getting free food, and I seem to remember him picking up garbage for this guy around his stall. I remember really one of the sad stories that I saw there. There was 3 little girls who were garbage pickers. And this was, again, an inherited job from their family. They would wade through piles of garbage because the garbage just would get collected into these giant piles, and they'd sort it. Think of a pile the size of this stage, knee-high or so, walking through, sifting out paper, plastics, food, and that was their role. In this environment, I realized people's stories, these kids experience a very prescriptive life. Also in New Delhi, Abdul Rahman, I do not have a picture of him, but he was a professor at an Islamic university. He taught minority politics, and we connected through mutual friends, and he wanted to talk, and he shared with me about his family who was being persecuted in the state of Orissa, as was much of the Islamic community in that state. Mr. Rahman wanted to talk to me about what it's like to be a follower of a persecuted religion. He wanted to talk about persecution. He wanted to talk about what that means for your faith. As a 21-year-old, I didn't even know how to interact with that from a small town perspective. I found the conversations very interesting. And maybe that was part of the reason why I wanted to pursue some study in this whole idea of peace building. Which led me a few years later to meet this man. His name's Prashanta, in the middle of the screen there. Prashanta is a pastor in a small church in Faridpur, Bangladesh. He'd invited David Shank, the guy on your left there, because David had worked within Christian-Muslim context throughout the world, working at building peace, reconciliation. And Prashanta's church had recently, at the time I'd been there, experienced opposition from their community, culminating in some weapon-wielding protests and even verbal death threats. And he had to approach the police, and it was a fairly tense time. He was very overjoyed that David agreed to come. And David was one of my instructors at the time, so I got to join him. And David was teaching about reconciliation in both the Christian and Muslim communities of that town. He was very excited to receive David's book, a book written by a Christian and Muslim who were dialoguing about their beliefs rather than fighting about them. And because the book was forwarded and supported by very prominent both Christian and Muslim leaders, Prashanta hoped that it would actually become a tool for renewal in their community, and it had just been translated into the local language. My final story is this lady, Petronella. She's on the far right of your screen. She's a refugee woman, Congolese, who is living in Durban, South Africa. She was part of this refugee community, struggling to survive in a new culture with a new language. And she, along with several other women in her refugee community who were widows, who had children that they needed to support, needed to figure out what to do, how to actually make life work, how to survive in this new place. And so their plan was that they would find as much work as they could between the group of them. Some got part-time jobs, others had full-time jobs, as long as there was one person who could look after the kids. That was their goal. And so what they ended up doing was setting up it's called a creche, a sort of basically a preschool, day school. And there was always one of these women working. And what they do is they would share the earnings of the entire group with one another equally. It's quite beautiful. These are a few of the relationships I encountered. A few strange stories to my young ears. And I became a witness to these stories. And I realize when you become a witness to stories, especially stories of suffering, you have to live in a space of tension. I saw strange things, so I had to process them personally as well as socially. And as a witness to something, you enter into it, you have to gain a new perspective on seeing the world. And sometimes new perspectives require new language. And this is where I return now to the psalm, where this language used by the psalmist might actually resonate differently and provide value that I had not seen before. So in Psalm 10, 2-6, it says, "The wicked arrogantly hunt down the poor. Let them be caught in the evil they plan for others, for they brag about their evil desires. They praise the greedy and curse the Lord. The wicked are too proud to seek God. They seem to think that God is dead, yet they succeed in everything they do. They do not see your punishment awaiting them. They sneer at all their enemies. They think, nothing bad will ever happen to us. We'll be free of trouble forever." And as I listen to the psalmist's words here, I can imagine their emotional tone is pretty heavy. I hear lament, I hear anguish. Honestly, I probably don't do it justice as I read it. Like I said before, I don't connect sometimes with these psalms. Walter Brueggemann convicts me by saying this. He says, "The absence of lament is the stifling of the question of theodicy." I mean, the capacity to raise and legitimate questions of justice. In other words, he continues and he says, "In regularly using the lament form, Israel kept the justice question visible and legitimate." And I bet if you heard or participated in a psalm of lament to God in ancient Israel, you would do so knowing God as the God of the Exodus, the one who acted on your behalf, on the behalf of the poor and the oppressed. This was Israel's experience, and they demanded it for others. It's quite a beautiful thing. The psalm continues, and the psalmist says, "Their mouths are full of cursing, lies, and threats. Trouble and evil are on the tips of their tongues. They lurk in ambush in the villages, waiting to murder innocent people. They are always searching for helpless victims. Like lions crouched in hiding, they wait to pounce on the helpless. Like hunters, they capture the helpless and drag them away in nets. Their helpless victims are crushed. They fall beneath the strength of the wicked. The wicked think, God isn't watching us. He's closed his eyes and won't even see what we do." What the psalmist is doing here is an act of solidarity. The words and the deeds of the powerful, he's exposing them in front of God and in a sense mockingly reiterating their speech in front of God, saying, God, they are even saying this to you. They're saying this about you. The language of the Psalms is amazing. They don't mince their words. They aren't passive-aggressive about things. They don't talk in cliches a lot of the time. They don't restrain their feelings at all. It's pretty harsh. And I think that's important for their relationship with God. It's important that they don't censor their feelings, because maintaining a relationship in the midst of pain, in the midst of seeing these things, is really important. I can think of any time in my life when I had sort of a tense moment in a relationship with someone, whether it's something that was said, whether it was some distance that was created. When we actually got down to difficult conversation, it was meaningful. It drew us back together in a unique way. So I think it's important to actually listen to the psalmist's complaint and not hurry past and try to find resolution right away, because they invite us into a space of darkness in the world. And there's two reasons why I think that's important. I think it's important for those who are already in the darkness, for those who are already there. The psalmists bring words, they bring an expression that might not have been said otherwise for them. Permission to express feelings to God that we carry, our angers, our frustration, our rage, our confusion, maybe even our actual hatred of things. So for those already in the darkness, it gives words. For those on the outside, that's not a familiar situation, the psalmist brings it to our attention, says, hey, this exists out there. And they forbid us to sort of cover it over with cliches and immediately find comforts, run to find the resolution on things. We find a very powerful demonstration of this later in Scripture as Jesus on the cross cries, my God, why have you forsaken me? Quoting Psalm 22, which resembles very much Psalm 10. Jesus identifies this similar sentiment of the psalmists praying a song of complaint. And Richard Bauckham has this to say. He says that Jesus, in entering the psalmist's darkness and taking up the psalmist's protest, Jesus became that solidarity of God with all who experience God's absence. Maybe by expressing to God rage, confusion, frustration, hatred, these emotional things that are there in these situations, and sometimes even a desire for vengeance. What we're doing is we're at least submitting those things and yielding those feelings. We're actually unearthing those feelings to God relinquishing them, releasing them off of ourselves so that we can maybe have the capacity to enter into doing something. I think when we are encountering new stories, I call them strange stories to my own ears, stories of suffering, we have a responsibility to feel something, and that might just happen naturally. We probably have a responsibility to think something about it, actually make it a part of our conscious, and of course to do something. And part of the doing, maybe even the first step in the doing that I see with the psalmists, is relinquishing those first things that hold us back from taking action. I don't know what to do, I feel angry about this. To share that does something important. Because, as Brueggemann said, where there's no lament, no complaint, those justice questions just get pushed back. They might even become invisible. Brueggemann even makes it more practical by saying a community of faith that negates lament soon concludes that the hard issues of justice are improper questions to pose at the throne because the throne seems to be only a place of praise. The throne being when we come before God. He insinuates to me, this is how I interpret this, a difficult question, one that I struggle to hear, but for me he says, hey, have you made space for lament in your life? Have you stifled the role of lament in your life when you come before God? You know, coming back to the story of Kajal, when I was living in New Delhi for a time, working with this Street Kids program, learning about their stories, one day I thought to myself, and I don't know why this thought was there, I was like, why haven't I cried about this yet? It bothered me, really bothered me that I hadn't cried about it. But maybe that was the first part of receiving a new story, something strange. Maybe that was the opening of lament. In the more recent chapters of my own story, I have been blessed to meet, not necessarily all over the world or anything like that, but right here in my own space, in my own context, people who also bear witness to suffering, stories that are strange to me. I'm discovering needs wherever I am, because they are everywhere. In our own space here in our province, there's issues related to residential schools, urban homelessness. There are refugees settling in our city, much like Petronella. In my previous job with Bethany College, I had opportunity several years in a row to visit different First Nation reserves with students on week-long learning trips. You encounter lots of new stories. Got a chance to go to several Truth and Reconciliation events related to talking about the residential schools. And you know, together some of these experiences have opened my eyes to pain that is close by, stories that are right in front of us. So my journey has come here and sort of opening my eyes in the places where I am. And you know, it helps to have a friend to walk alongside you to process these sorts of things. And while not physically present, someone I consider sort of a friend is Bruce Cockburn, and maybe more specifically his music. He's also gone on a journey. He's processed things he's seen. And I want to offer you this morning a dialogue I've had with, not him in particular, but one of his songs. The song is called Red Brother, Red Sister. It's a story of Cockburn's journey. It's a story of him explaining things about encountering things he's seen in Canada. Now, Cockburn's a reporter. Cockburn's a journalist. He's a storyteller. Moreover, he's a poet. And poetry, like the Psalms, there's often not direct meaning to find. And I think that's important. So as I encounter and even play this song, there's no direct meaning to find. And what's important about that is it helps us find our own meaning. There's no timeless meaning for the words in Cockburn's song. Sometimes the way the psalmists say something is meant to inspire us to think about our own stories. And so in Red Brother, Red Sister, what we're given are three stories, three scenes that Cockburn unpacks for us. They're in 3 verses, and each of these scenes are interrupted by a sort of chant-like chorus. And the form that Cockburn is using is meant to draw us into the stories that he's telling and give us a little bit of space to digest them, I think. In the first scene, Cockburn is sharing about his visit to a Canadian museum. And I like to kind of think that it's the museum in Winnipeg. I've been there. I don't know if you guys have been to the Canadian Museum in Winnipeg. There's all those stuffed taxidermy animals. Those rigid mannequin props and those sort of painted landscape backgrounds makes you feel like you're there, but you're not really. Kind of worked as a kid. That's kind of what we're looking at in this first scene. Went to the museum, Red Brother. Saw your ancient bloom cut, pressed and dried. Sign said, wasn't it clever what they used to do? But it never did say how they died. Hey, hey, hey. So we begin with his reflections from a visit to a museum. Again, I think it's the one in Winnipeg, but we don't know. And the sign that he sees there, maybe even more so the ones who painted it, who wrote it, sort of paints a certain perspective on history. And the chorus, I might read into it, I read into it personally as I hear it. Is it Cockburn listening to voices of others, or is he offering his own? As we leave behind this first scene, which I think is one of his reflections on history, we arrive in the present in the next verse. I went to Regina, Red Sister. Heard a cab driver say what he'd seen. There's a grand place to eat out on number 1. All white ladies, if you know what I mean. Hey, 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 second scene, when I hear it, it teases out some of the possible consequences of the first, that sometimes the way that we understand history forms us in ways that we might not realize. And it contains imagery kind of familiar to my ears. The idea of stigmas and assumptions and misunderstandings on things. So now as the song transitions to the final verse, the final scene, we're brought into his experience of attending a powwow event. We hear his reaction to it. It's an emotional reaction. And this event, it's a celebration of singing and dancing, kind of an expression of identity. And I think what it does is it causes Cockburn to reflect on his own identity a little bit. I went to a powwow, Red Brother. Saw the people's love of joy all around. Left me crying just thinking about it. How they used my Savior's name to keep you down. This final scene closes with his personal experience, his personal response. It's an emotional reaction. He becomes a witness to something. He becomes a witness to another's story. So these three scenes together I find are quite brilliant. They're quite poetic. His journey is one from ignorance to recognition of something to entering into something. It does mimic my own story, and I resonate with Coburn. That's why I say it's a dialogue. It's something that I'm processing. Someone to help me process my own experiences, my own witness of strange stories. And as simple as it may seem, this song represents that to me. It represents a process. The verses by themselves, maybe not, but all together, there's something going on there. So I think it's important to see strange in the familiar. You know, the places where I grew up, the places where I am now, that I think are safe to see them with new eyes. And I think the psalmists give us sometimes language to do that. There are plenty of examples right in front of me, only sometimes do I see them, only sometimes am I aware of them or even want to see them. Returning once again, the psalmist closes in Psalm 10, verse 12, and says, "Arise, O Lord, punish the wicked, O God, do not ignore the helpless." Again, they call on God, much like the beginning of the psalm, except that here, there's a tone of expectation, there's a tone I hear of urgency. And as the psalmist continues, I hear that urgency even more clearly as they say, "Why do the wicked get away with despising God? They think God will never call us to account. But you see the trouble and grief they cause. You take note of it and punish them. The helpless put their trust in you. You defend the orphans. Lord, you know the hopes of the helpless. Surely you will hear their cries and comfort them. You will bring justice to the orphans and the oppressed, so mere people can no longer terrify them." The psalmist, having processed, having shared their emotions, now places their hope in God, hope that things will change. Again, Brueggemann helps us see this psalm for what it is, and he says it creates a possibility for energy, courage, hope, and imagination that orders powers differently. These psalms, these songs of lament, of complaint, of petition, of protest, are concerned with the redistribution of power. But not in the human way, not in a way of leading to doing it on our own, because that often leads to more inequalities in different places, but by processing those emotions with God and putting our hope in God to reorder things. I think as I read these psalms, recognize my role as a witness. The church stands as a witness in the world to stories of suffering, as seen in psalms like this. And we're not allowed to make these justice questions slide out of sight, but urgently make them known, just like the psalmists do here. And hope then to join with God in the renewal of things. I'll close with a prayer. Lord, thank you for receiving our complaints, our laments. Lord, we have emotions about things. We see things that we don't understand. And Lord, you are there ready to receive our thoughts, our words, and help us process them, Lord. Thank you that there are others, Lord, in the world who are doing likewise, and that when we gather together, we do something unique. We hold these things before you, Lord, and hope that with your presence that we can join with you, Lord, in writing these things, encountering them, in restoring relationships, redistributing power in whatever ways, Lord, that you can help us to do. Lord, help us to continue to have new eyes to see, much like the psalmists do, to make space in our lives for lament, and find out how that is to move us to action, Lord. And thank you for your presence in all of this. We ask that you go with us today. In your name, amen.